Well, good evening. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you, OSU, for having me here, and for the county and local bookstore that's sponsored. That's awesome to hear, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here tonight. And so what I'd like to do for the audience here is just play a short 2-minute Vimeo clip here. And how this is going to go is I'm going to share a slideshow also directly from my screen. We found that it's the best way to sort of share these images in real time without too much lag. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and start the video here.
I'm Stuart Palley, and I photograph wildfires. I go into burning forests with my camera in order to share the story of climate change with the world. From the backyards of suburban Los Angeles to Half Dome in Yosemite, the state is being consumed by fire. Through my work, I forged friendships with firefighters, evacuees, and families of those who have perished in the flames. They have helped me capture the images that tell the story of our new climate reality.
Thank you, everybody, for taking a minute to watch that. I hope the video came through okay. And I'm going to go ahead and hop into the presentation now. So I'll go ahead and preface this by saying there's about 24 images here, and I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about the stories behind some of these pictures and a little bit about my experience as a photographer and photojournalist photographing these fires in California. Now, we are very fortunate in the state of California to have access to these fires as credentialed media. By law, we are allowed into these areas with the caveat, of course, that we're on our own and we're not to impede on any safety or with the efforts of first responders. So we are very fortunate to have that access and privilege here in the state, and it's allowed me and a lot of my colleagues to sort of get very up close and personal with these fires to share this. And of course, much of this audience is probably based in Oregon, which has experienced a lot of the same wildfires and urban interface impacts from these fires in a lot of communities, especially in the southern part of the state. So the first image you're seeing, this is from the Powerhouse Fire in 2013 in Los Angeles County. And this is very typical of our high desert urban interface that we face, and an example of the fuels here in Southern California in our chaparral environment. It's a Mediterranean climate. We typically have a lot of smaller, flashier fuels, and typically up in Oregon, it's more of big timber. But you will see as we go through the presentation, we will also encounter some of those scenes that have more in common with the Oregon area. And of course, we've got a Type 1 helicopter. It's a very large helicopter dropping around 1,000 gallons of water on this blaze. And this was one of the first large fires I photographed. And as soon as I took this picture, I had to run back to my car and go down the road because the fire was moving fast. So I certainly, after this fire, put safety first, photographing these fires. I went and did formal wildland fire training, purchased all the same PPE a wildland firefighter would have. But of course, I'm carrying a camera and not actively doing any fire suppression. I'm there to document it. Another early image of mine, this is from 2013 near Idlewild. And this was one of the first times I set my camera up at night to photograph the fires using long exposures. And I was very much captured and captivated by the way the fire sort of painted the landscape. This entire scene is lit with the fire itself and that chemical reaction and energy release of this carbon burning right now. And it was just crazy to see this because it was almost like you were staring into the depths of hell itself. At the same time, Fire is important to the forest ecosystem to maintain homeostasis. Of course, in a situation like these where you have 100% consumption of fuels, complete consumption of fuels, that's not necessarily the ideal type of fire or burn we would like to have. And some of those complexities with when and how we burn are a little bit out of the scope of this conversation with photos, but I'm sure that's something that has been or will be discussed throughout this series. There's some wonderful presenters up and coming that I'm sure will have wonderful things to say too about when and where and how we burn. This is one image that tells a story in a bit of a different way. This is the El Portal fire in Yosemite National Park. And for this picture, I stood about 3 miles away on an opposite ridge with a very long telephoto or zoom lens to compress into the scene and sort of show the topography and where the fire was occurring. And what I like to do in my work is put a fire in the context of the geographic location. Is it in Los Angeles in the wild and urban interface, or is it here amongst sugar pines and other types of pines, mixed conifers, and this 5,000 to 7,000 foot elevation range in the Sierra? Is it happening in the desert? I think it's important to put the fire in the context of the situation so the viewer can better understand sort of what's going on and maybe come away saying, hey, I learned something about wildfire more than just looking at a pretty picture. This is another picture. This is that's probably a defining image from the Terra Flamma project. Another fire in Yosemite, different fire though. This is the meadow fire that happened in September 2014, just behind Half Dome. It was actually started by lightning, natural cause fire, actually a pretty good burn, really good at cleaning up the forest in the back there, but it was originally being managed as a let it burn fire. And then a warm day, it sort of blew out and they had to use helicopters to evacuate hikers going up the top of Half Dome. So I drove up from LA and spent the whole night shooting pictures from Glacier Point Lookout. And this was right in the pre-dawn minutes when the sky cleared a bit and we were able to get the glow of the fire over Half Dome. So to me, again, this is an example. You've got Half Dome, the Yosemite Valley to the lower left, sort of showing when and where and how these fires happen. This picture shows how embers cause fire spread and how wind events really drive fire behavior. This is taken during a San Ana wind event in the foothills of the Angeles National Forest in eastern Los Angeles County. So this fire was burning right up against subdivisions where the Angeles National Forest meets development in Azusa and Rancho Cucamonga. And this was actually a few hours after the fire came through, but these trees were still smoldering. There were 40 to 60 mile an hour wind gusts. And so even though most of the lighter fuels on these trees had been consumed, these trunks were still throwing off thousands of embers a minute, as you can see. And this was about a 60-second time exposure. And you can imagine it was a little bit dicey making this picture. Again, I'm wearing helmet, goggles, shroud, all of that. But in this kind of wind, the embers love to find their way, under a collar or in your shoulder, or any time there's a hole in the Nomex, the embers in this kind of wind love to find their way into places where they make contact with your skin. So you have to be very careful and minimize your time in these situations. This is an old Cal Fire firefighter friend of mine. He's now a battalion chief at a smaller fire department in Northern California. And this is actually the day we met at a fire in 2014. And this is an image I also put in my book because this particular firefighter, and I'm curious if anybody watching knows who he is, ended up becoming a very good friend of mine. And I've probably ridden shotgun in his fire rig at half a dozen fires, if not more since then. Some of the big fires we've had down here, Thomas Fire, Walbridge Fire, other blazes, and having that opportunity to photograph firefighters in the wildland and their element, literally from the front seat, has been a tremendous privilege to sort of tell their story here. So this is a very typical scene of what we find with fires in Northern California here, mostly chaparral with a little bit of scrub oak. You can see there's a manzanita on the left side of the frame. And these are sort of the typical situations I find myself in, rolling hills, lighter fuels, some trees as you get higher up in elevation. It typically in rural areas like this in wine country. And this region is in Napa County. And in this area, I've been to probably close to 20 fires in the last 3 years. So this area has been affected very heavily by an increased severity and frequency of fire. Now, getting back a little bit to more of the art emphasis. So one of the goals of Terra Flamma, of course, is to document wildfires from a photojournalistic standpoint. But it's also important that I try and take an artistic approach to the images within photojournalistic standards and ethics to get the viewers of attention. Because if I'm going to make a pretty picture and it gets somebody's attention, to me, that's a win. Because again, maybe they'll come away learning about wildfire. So this is the lake fire in 2015. This fire got pretty close to Big Bear, but not too close, but definitely was causing some concerns with firefighters. And this is a Joshua tree, the Yucca brevifolia. I probably butchered the Latin pronunciation, but it just got provisionally listed as an endangered species. Millions of these have been killed in the last few years by fire, notably in the Mojave National Preserve, and they're not really growing back. So the Joshua tree and fire sort of have a fraught relationship right now. And to me, this sort of summed up the beauty of this somewhat strange tree that's endemic to the Mojave Desert, and then the cool tones of the night sky, and then, of course, the glow of the fire itself. To me, it was all about tension and duality. Of course, in these fires, you end up photographing a lot of property destruction, homes, businesses, cars, and this picture from 2015 was no exception. This was another fire in Northern California in Lake County, about an hour outside of wine country in Sonoma and Napa. And you can just see the complete consumption of fuels. I mean, this trailer at the top of a hill didn't stand a chance. I don't know if it was somebody's primary residence or like a hunting getaway or whatever it was, but it was really tragic to see this burned. And it was a very dystopian feel. Everything is gray, and except for the kind of pinks in the sky. And there's actually two heads of the fire here. Of course, you see the flames on the right, but if you look to your left, between the left side of the RV and the power line, you can see another pyrocumulus or column of smoke emanating from the fire. So what you're seeing is the main body of fire on the left and the spot fire that erupted on the right. That was close to 1,000 acres by the time sunset happened. So again, this image sort of shows both the scale and the severity of the burn, and also some of the development that's impacted by these blazes. Now jumping over to the Western Sierras, this was taken in 2015 at the Rough Fire, which is still the largest fire in Fresno County history. It burned in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park. And this is taken from the Buck Rock Fire Lookout Tower at about 8,000 feet at about 9:30 p.m. as the inversion layer was settling down into the Kings River Gorge, I believe is the geographic feature where the flames are. And I actually used a flashlight to light paint the foreground. It's a little fuzzy because it was low light and there was a little bit of noise coming off the sensor. But to me, this image really shows the terrain, the density of forest, how dry some of the fuels are. I mean, even in this frame, you can see a couple pine trees that have suffered, that are dead either from drought or bark beetle kill, or a combination of the two. And of course, that increases the dry fuels available to burn during fire season. And this fire did eventually burn almost all the way to this lookout tower. And just last fall in September, the other, and I'm blanking on the name, even though I was there covering it, the wildfire that threatened the General Sherman and other trees in this park almost made it to this fire lookout tower too. So a lot of the areas that we've seen catch on fire in the Sierra Nevada and California have been terrain and topography and flora and fauna similar to this scene. And again, going back to property impacts, this was the most destructive and deadliest fire I'd photographed up until this point, 2015. This was the Valley Fire in Middletown, and it destroyed the central part of Middletown in Lake County. And you encounter these scenes that are just heartbreaking. I mean, this is the front entryway to what was somebody's home a day after the fire front came through. There's still flames coming up from the gas line that was in their kitchen. This is where I belong, the little sign over the entranceway. And what's funny is I've never noticed this in this photo until I'm talking about it live right now, but there's Christmas lights hanging over that front trellis. And it's so strange to me how certain things survive and certain things don't. The fire hopscotches and sort of takes what it wants. The house is gone, but the front fence is still there, and these lights there haven't melted. To me, it's very strange. And again, it goes back to this duality of fire being beautiful yet destructive yet necessary, but not happening in necessarily the best ways that we need right now for healthy forests. Jumping back to Los Angeles, to me, this image encapsulates the WUI or wildland urban interface that we face in Southern California. We've got a prison inmate crew sleeping above $1 million plus homes in the Pasadena Duarte area. You can't really see it on this screen, but I'll move my cursor over. Well, if you look above the crew and the homes, center left of the frame, you can actually see downtown Los Angeles and the skyscrapers in downtown LA. And this is the edge of the Angeles National Forest. There's a helicopter dropping at night. That's what the lights are, and it's long exposure. So again, to me, this is showing how and where the fire happens and how we have built homes right up to the very edge of where these fires take place. Going back to the Joshua Tree, these were a grove of a few thousand trees that were killed at the Erskine fire in 2016 near Lake Isabella. And one thing you find at fires is they're in a little bit more remote areas, so you have lower light pollution. So you're able to mix in the summer the Milky Way with flames. And I think this was my headlamp or passing car headlights that lit these trees. But this was a tough image to make because I grew up in Southern California. I love Joshua trees. I go to the park all the time. I have a cabin out there. And so to see these trees that mean so much to me and to so many other people, and that are a critical component to the Mojave Desert ecosystem killed like this is really heartbreaking. You know, the same pit I get in my stomach when a house is lost. It's the same thing with seeing these trees go. And it's tough because, again, you know, they're not growing back. They've been impacted pretty heavily. But again, there's a strange beauty to it in these trees and their repose after they've been killed by fire. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time. And I hope viewers sort of take that message to learn a little bit more. This is a behind the scenes image for me working a couple years ago. It's the cover of the book that's coming out too in April. And this sort of just shows the setup that I use when I'm out there working. You know, I've got the same Nomex firefighters would wear. I've got my hard hat. I've got a GoPro mounted on the hat, you know, radio, camera, boots, all that jazz, basically to be safe when I'm there. And this is in the Angeles National Forest at the Sand Fire. And behind me, there's a 35,000 foot tall pyrocumulus as Little Tahunga Canyon went up in about 2 hours. And we had to stay there for a little while because the road was not safe to pass because it was completely overrun with fire. And I'm sure anybody who's watching right now who's been at these fires, looking at the pyrocumulus and the terrain and the fuels that have already burned, how intense that fire behavior is on the ground, or was on the ground rather, behind me. Again, another dystopian scene. This is on the 15 freeway in San Bernardino County. This Blue Cut fire actually shut down interstate commerce between Los Angeles and Las Vegas for like 8 hours. And that's like $20 million of lost revenue an hour, or something like that. And so with this project, you're put into these scenes of suspended reality. I mean, I was able to stand on the middle of a 12-lane interstate and then go off here and take a picture of this truck, you know, sitting very Mad Max style in this scene. So one thing we're finding is that while many of these fires do occur in more remote areas, where we build, if fire behavior and fire activity is part of that ecosystem, which in pretty much everywhere in SoCal it is, the fire is eventually going to happen. You know, the question is whether we let it happen on our terms or nature's or climate change's terms. And in this case, extreme heat wave, dry fuels, and it burned, you know, tens of thousands of acres in just a day. So this is an example of that extreme fire behavior. Something a little bit quieter, of course. There's those crazy colors and the impacts of fires, both with people and plants, but sometimes fire is very subtle. This is the railroad fire up near Yosemite National Park in 2017. The fire had burned through and there were just a few pines left that were still burning in their trunks. And this was taken under a full moon, just one tree burning. I made a few pictures and left. And this is one of my personal favorite images because it shows how dense this forest is and how that ground got burned. But there's still a lot of ladder fuels there in those trees, and the density of this canopy and forest is not necessarily the healthiest thing. And again, you know, forestry and ecology experts can speak better to that than I can. But based on my understanding, this density of forest is still a little bit too dense. Going back to putting fires in their geographic location, This is the 2017 wine country fire siege in Napa and Sonoma counties. This was not the Tubbs fire, but the Atlas fire, which was about an hour east. You've got fire coming down into a vineyard in a property that's been there since the late 19th century, just sort of showing the values at risk. After I made this frame, I spent the night photographing the El Dorado hotshots, protecting the winery. They saved the whole darn thing. It was impressive to see. And these vineyards actually ended up giving firefighters fire breaks to work with. Obviously, it was an extreme wind event, so you had ember cast well over the vineyards, but at least it gave them some sort of fighting chance to protect structures and properties and other values at risk, having these vineyards in the way of a fire. Again, going back to that firefighter colleague of mine, this sort of shows the human impact of fires. That's a structure behind us that had just been saved from burning, and it was being rehabbed and having some things fixed. There was a break in the action, and the firefighter here is, and this is 5 days before Christmas at the Thomas fire in December 2017. So it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We've been up all day, and he's FaceTiming his family, you know, his wife and daughters, to say goodnight. And I think the look on his face says it all. And obviously, this is a picture of a firefighter with CAL FIRE, the California Department of Forestry, which is the state firefighting agency. But of course, these same moments happen with firefighters in the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, you know, local and county firefighters. They're all out there on these 2-week shifts at fires, away from friends and family, missing all of it. So, you know, this feeling spans the fire world. And a lot of my firefighter friends have, you know, experienced quite a bit of fallout and trauma from the severity and intensity and length of fire deployments. This is a picture of Masao Barrows, who actually just texted me yesterday. We were catching up. He is a carpenter that lives in Thousand Oaks in Southern California. And this is him running out of his burning rental home at about 3 o'clock in the morning as the Woolsey fire came into the town of Thousand Oaks. And this house is in the flatlands, not in the hill. It's in a subdivision. They saved the house with some damage. That's his pickup truck on the right. He still drives it with a melted taillight in the back right. It's an old Ford Ranger pickup. And he basically ran out down the street to a sheriff's cruiser and got a ride out of the fire, and literally left with the clothes on his back. And luckily he was okay. He lost some of his tools, but I actually interview him in my book, and there's a chapter about this photo and moment in there. But again, this really encapsulates the human element, how, you know, fire can happen anytime, anywhere. I bet these people, despite a red flag warning, were not expecting this sort of fire behavior in a suburban area, well away from sort of what we would consider the wild and urban interface in Southern California. This was taken the morning after I photographed Masao running out of his home. This is driving into Malibu in November 2018. And these are people evacuating west out of Malibu towards Ventura County as the Woolsey fire came down to the beach. And you can just see this eerie feeling, the lights of the cars on. It was 10:30 in the morning. And you know, these cars were just evacuating. And I apologize, I'm getting distracted for a second. We're actually, I'm here in my office in Southern California. We're actually getting hit by, I can hear hail hitting my window. We had thunderstorms forecasted for today, and I didn't think they'd come to fruition. So I think it's a good omen that I'm giving a fire presentation and we're getting a little rain outside. So something to be thankful for. This was taken about an hour after that evacuation photo with the cars. This is Sarah Dowd and Jordan Pope standing near the home they were staying in Troncos Canyon in Malibu. And this is when the fire is coming into the neighborhood. You can see a fire crew trying to extinguish a spot fire on the right. 30 seconds after taking this photo, we got another spot fire in the canyon directly below the road. Ripped up the canyon. We all had to drive downhill because, of course, the fire behavior became too extreme and it was no longer safe to be there. In the neighborhood you're looking at, about half the homes were destroyed in the next 15 minutes, but about half of them did survive. But I think this was the last photo anyone ever took of a lot of those houses still standing. And you can just see the fire moving downhill with the Santa Ana wind event. Eventually, the fire actually burned horizontally downhill, being pushed by those offshore winds. So again, yeah, this is a situation where I witnessed extreme fire behavior. You know, these two young folks experiencing what was one of the most traumatic and tough days of their lives, and to be able to have the opportunity to to make this photo is a privilege and humbling, and sort of still gives me chills when I look at it. And I've stayed in touch with both of them as well, and their story is also in the book. And that's one thing, in addition to taking all these photos, or making them rather, I've been very grateful that I've been able to sort of write a little bit of the stories behind the pictures too. This is Malibu that night after the fire moved through the neighborhood and they evacuated. The fire went all the way to the Great Pacific Fire Break, also known as the Pacific Ocean. This is Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu. To the right of me is a 50-foot cliff, and then it's sand. And the fire was burning ice plant that Caltrans put in next to the highway dividers, and then it literally didn't stop till it hit the sand. So it was one of the more surreal scenes of my life. This is Mari K. Ellert. She is a farrier, or someone who does horseshoes, and she was a volunteer with the El Dorado County Search and Rescue Team in 2018 at the campfire in the town of Paradise. So when Paradise was under siege, I was on the beach in Malibu when it was burning. And so I didn't get up to Paradise to cover that fire in the campfire in November 2018 and until it was in the recovery phase. And here she is with her team, basically going through house to house, searching for human remains. And thankfully, when I was with them, they didn't find any, but they did find 2 victims the day before, and they did rescue an injured cat. So this was a really traumatic experience, I think, for everyone involved, because at this point, this wasn't photographing a fire or some sort of pretty scene out in the woods that may have been beneficial for the ecosystem. This was just a fire that flattened a town. And I think everybody here is familiar with what happened in Paradise, but basically you had a town on top of a butte that was in the direct crosshairs of a large fire front. And the vast majority of the town was destroyed in a matter of hours, with nearly 100 people killed in the fire. So I was actually back in Paradise in the fall working on a story. The town is starting to be rebuilt in some areas. They're putting in new fuel breaks and fuel buffers, but it's going to be a long time till the town is ever the same. But I give very much credit and kudos to the resiliency of those who have been impacted by the fire there, whether they've chosen to stay or to leave. It's certainly a big, daunting task to rebuild a town. And that's a conversation too for another day. Should we rebuild Paradise? And if we do rebuild it, should be the same as before? These are all questions that I hope some of these images bring up in viewers' minds. This is another scene from Paradise. This is a church that burned, looking into one of the rooms, and you can see some burned school chairs. And this was a mural painted with the consent of property owners after the fire by a muralist named Shane Grammer, who's based in Los Angeles. And a lot of these buildings were eventually demolished for hazard and safety reasons. So before most of these buildings were demolished, I went up there after the fire in the spring and photographed most of these murals as sort of documenting art and commentary on this fire. And it was sort of a strange, surreal beauty to see this in the ashes. And after talking to folks who lived in Paradise, it sounds like they appreciated it too, that somebody went in and just sort of tried to create a little bit of beauty, or at least reflection, in what was left of their former homes. Jumping to another subject, this was a hike that I did to the deployment area of the Granite Mountain Hot Shots in Yarnell, Arizona. This is up in Skull Valley, just west of the town of Yarnell. And this is the site where the crew perished in 2013. And this is standing behind the stone cairns, looking at where each crew member was found. You can see the flag that's at half mast. And I actually did this hike with Amanda Marsh, who's the founder of the Eric Marsh Foundation for Wildland Firefighters, and the widow of Eric Marsh, who was the crew superintendent here. And it was the second or third time she had been back to the deployment site. And it's actually the last chapter in the book. And it was sort of this pilgrimage for her and for me too, to sort of go with her and hear her tell the story. But personally, it's important for me to go pay my respects to these sites. I've hiked to the Pulaski Tunnel up in Wallace, Idaho. I've chartered a boat and gone up to Man Gulch in Gates of the Wilderness Preserve up in Montana to go to where Young Men and Fire happened out there. So I think it's important for my understanding of fire history and respect for those who have given their lives fighting fires to sort of understand how that happened and to be there to pay my respects. And that's it for the slideshow. Looks like I went through a little bit quicker than I had expected. So Carly, we can totally open it up to questions. I can add more things. It's whatever your preference is.
Thanks so much. That was really powerful to see those images and also to hear that strong rain on your window. Thank you for sharing.
I'm not sure. I apologize if that came through, but it got loud for a second, and that doesn't always happen here in Southern California.
No, it doesn't. So thanks for letting us be there in that moment with you and telling us what was going on. Everybody out there, you are welcome to put questions in the Q&A box. And Stuart, where to begin? You have created so many pictures of what is happening in California, and people who are watching tonight are from all over the US and all over the world, but so this will be different everywhere. But in Oregon, we have a really different aesthetic relationship with wildfire because there's no way for photographers or videographers to document the images or what's happening. So what do you think about the importance of access and the public benefit, if you think there is some of access?
That's a great question. Well, first and foremost, I do think that there should be better access for media in every state in the US where fire is an issue. It's absolutely critical to public education, information, and understanding when the fires are happening and afterwards. And frankly, it's generally public employees who are out there battling the blazes, and the public has a right to see the hard work that those men and women are doing. I think it's important that we show what Forest Service firefighters are doing or state or local firefighters are doing, because frankly, they all need to get paid more, especially on the federal side, and have better access to benefits and mental health care. And I think one of the main ways we do that is by showing what they're dealing with. And that's great that we have this body of work and record in California, but I can't go to Oregon and do this. It's changing a little bit, and there's been some things put on the books, but of course, there's a responsibility with that, right? If we're in an area where it's dangerous, we need to make sure that we have fire training, PPE, and that we're putting safety first. No pictures worth compromising safety or ethics or respect for those who are either fighting the fires or impacted by them. But as we've seen in the series, this is an ongoing issue. I mean, look at what happened in Talent in southeastern Oregon, southern Oregon. We don't have the same body of historic record to tell these stories. And I think ultimately, in some ways, that's a loss for the public record, for training, for analysis purposes. Luckily, the Forest Service and some other agencies do have programs to assign videographers and photographers directly through the incident command at fires, but it doesn't always get utilized like it should, in my opinion. So, for those of you who are watching, of course, I know there's a lot of, divisions or opinions with media and things here and there, but hopefully, my work and what I'm sharing speaks for itself, that I really do care and my colleagues do care about telling the story. And, we just want to be able to tell that story. And I think it's an important tourist story to tell. And frankly, the public deserves to see it.
Yeah, thank you. What drew you into this type of photography? How did fire call to you?
It's a great question. My background is in photojournalism history, and I've always been interested in how humankind tries to harness the resources of the world and create our lives around it, whether it's electricity production, water consumption, and how we do that, and sometimes how we're successful at it or how we fail at it. And before I started photographing fire, I was photographing drought down at the Salton Sea in Southern California, which is its own ecological mess. And that was all about water and the lack of it. And so I learned so much about the drought and how hydrology worked in the state. And as I was finishing that project, the drought ratcheted up in California, and we started having increased severity of fires. I was interning at the Orange County Register at the time. We had a large fire breakout here in the urban interface, and I was able to borrow safety gear from them, and I had press credentials. So I went and covered the fire for the paper. And I got there, and there was this 5-bedroom ranch home that was fully involved in fire. The fire had caught it uphill. The palm trees were torching. The firefighters, the structure guys, were in the garage pulling out some tools and a Barbie car and family photos before the timbers across the garage collapsed. All the patio furniture was in the pool, and it was covered in ash. And it was this collision again of human development and nature. And in some ways it was such a strange beauty, but of course here's this what's very clearly a family with, you know, young kids having lost their home. And I was like, wow, this is something here in my backyard. This is not something I need to travel halfway across the world to tell. You know, backyard being Southern California, I can drive out for a day or a week or a weekend for a couple hours. And of course, that scope is expanded to the northern part of the state now, but I can go tell the story in my own backyard. And growing up in Southern California, I mean, fire's on the periphery of your life. So this was just something that became very important to me as time went on.
Yeah. Well, in that story and in many of the other pictures that you showed, you know, you're experiencing a lot when you're out in the field. And we have a question about asking, how do you steel yourself against the traumatic reality of your work?
Great question. Well, there's two parts to that. The first of which, there's the immediacy when you're there and then the aftermath. So when I'm at a fire, I'm usually focused on staying aware, being safe, making pictures, driving safe, listening to radios, looking at maps, answering questions from other people, making sure a tree doesn't fall on me, you know, pulling over for engines going by, things like that. So there's a million and one things going on all at the same time. So I'm so consumed when I'm at fires with the present and being safe. I guess I don't even I guess the stealing myself happens with just being present and making sure I'm being safe, because the situation demands my full attention. Of course, driving to the fires is a whole other thing. You know, taking a few deep breaths, staying calm, thinking about escape routes, where this fire is happening, weather patterns, if I've been there before, you know, what are things I need to watch out for, things like that. So of course, I'm not a wildland firefighter, but I do have you know, I do my S-130 red card refresher every year with the Forest Service, because they sponsor me for the contract work I do for them. And of course, you've got your 10s and 18s, you know, your 18 watch out situation. Was it, gosh, I'm going to get butchered that I forgot, but your 10s and 18s, you know, the 10 standard orders of wildland firefighting, and then your 18 watch outs. And I think about this, all the same rules apply for when you're out there photographing. I mean, just because I'm not out there doing any active suppression, you know, you still have to think about the same things. And that's the thing, you know, provide for safety first and then go tell the story. And then after the fact, rest is important. Detoxing from smoke exposure. Stanford actually did a study about it. And I think in our lifetimes, we're going to see mandatory respirator use for wildland firefighters in certain situations, because the study basically showed that you get, every time you're at a fire, you get poisoned by the smoke. So I personally wear just like a P100 respirator. I carry around an air quality meter with me, but your body needs to rest after that. You need a couple days. So I just rest up, and you know, I take time to reflect or go to therapy or do, you know, take time to myself to make sure that I give myself the space to sort of process what I've seen, because, you know, firefighters are traumatized there when they're recovering people or doing evacuations. Residents are traumatized, and I don't experience that trauma, but I see it, and that does have a degree of a ripple effect. And so I think it's important for anybody that's involved in this field just to make sure to, you know, take care of yourself too. And that goes for anybody who's been evacuated by a fire or anything like that, because it can be very traumatic.
Yeah, thank you for that. Absolutely. So another question is that your work is journalistic, as you said, but clearly it's also very artful. So in your view, what's the role of art in terms of communication about fire? And when you look at your full body of work so far, what are you hoping to communicate? What are some of the big messages?
Going back to what I mentioned during the presentation, I think part of the approach here is I've always loved photographing at night and long exposure photography. So fire is its own light source, and it's warmer, and it's literally this chemical reaction, and that heat of the molecules and electrons getting excited within the whatever is burning, letting off that light. And that is a very unique light source. It's not something you can replicate with the sun or with the strobe or with the light or artificial light. It only happens with fire, and every fire is a little different with its own character. So in addition to photographing the geography of the fire, I try and capture, I guess, like the spirit or the soul of that fire in a way. And I feel like doing the long exposures and taking a more geometric approach, creating compositions. I want people to get drawn in by these pretty pictures of fire, to respect and appreciate it, but also understand the challenges that we face. So again, if I can combine art with documentary journalism and somehow find a combination of the two that works for, sharing this story, then to me, that's a success.
Thank you. And you're moving through kind of your first decade of doing this kind of work. So far, I guess the one of the things we've been looking at this year in this series is like the shift of the paradigm of how people perceive fire, and especially these big fires. What are you seeing, or what have you seen in this last decade that signals any kind of shift in public perception of fire, or with all these, different kinds of fire crews that you're talking with and spending time with?
Well, I think first off, we have to look at the numbers, both with the frequency, size, severity, and destruction of fires, and just in California in the last 5 years. I mean, the largest, most destructive, and deadliest fires in the state's modern recorded history have all happened within the last 3 to 5 years. And the same thing with Oregon in fall 2020. I mean, I believe those were the most destructive fires in Oregon's history. And I was just in Denver, Colorado over the weekend. And on Sunday, literally 2 days ago, I drove up to Boulder and to Louisville, where the Marshall Fire just happened 3 weeks ago, and toured with a resident who had been evacuated and whose home had barely survived, going through the burn area in the neighborhoods. And that area is 6 miles away from the nearest hill or mountain, really. I mean, it was really out in the flatlands. It's similar to what happened in Coffee Park in Santa Rosa, is that we're seeing a shift in when these fires happen. Just because it's a high fire hazard severity zone on the map and you're one block over, doesn't mean it automatically becomes zero fire severity. These fires are pushing further into areas we didn't think it could happen. Their spread is moving faster than some computer models are putting. I mean, the inputs for what's driving this fire behavior are truly unprecedented, at least in our modern recorded history. And you look at, for example, what happened at the Dixie Fire in Northern California. It burned almost 1 million acres. We almost had our first true gigafire, which is a very scary thing to say. I mean, and the Calder Fire burned over the Sierra Crest. It burned from the western slope to the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains. I mean, that is truly unprecedented in our time. So, and for impacts on firefighters, I mean, the state has increased the budget by tens of millions, if not billions of dollars, for fire suppression, fuels work, and prevention. We've hired more firefighters. I mean, there's a need to hire more firefighters too. We are getting to the point where the spread and speed of severity of these fires is straight up outstripping humankind's ability to suppress them. The fire behavior that I saw at the Calder and the Dixie Fire this summer, we were throwing a dozen air tankers at once, VLATs, everything, 5,000, 6,000 firefighters, hundreds of engines, but the fire was still calling the shots a lot of the time because of the fuels, the drought, heat, humidity, fire suppression where we built, and hotter overnight temperatures. And actually a study is coming out today that basically talks about the impact of higher nighttime temperatures on fires. So in conclusion on that question, one of the biggest shifts we're seeing is firefighters typically prefer to fight fire at night when the humidity is higher, temperatures are lower, and conditions are more favorable to suppression, like cutting bulldozer line or direct handline construction. And what we're seeing is some of the biggest shifts with climate change is the nights are hotter and drier, and these fires are staying very active overnight. So firefighters are not getting the breaks they normally once had where they can start to corral these blazes. So I think both in numbers and anecdotal evidence on the ground that we're seeing with fire behavior sort of speaks to what I've seen over the last decade.
Thanks for that. That's not something that we've talked about yet in this series, what's happening at night. So thanks for that, and for all these images of what's going on at night. When we were chatting just briefly before we started this evening, you said, you've been working on the new book, and so you haven't had that much time to photograph fires lately, and you're looking forward to getting back out there. Looking forward, what kind of stories do you want to tell in the next decade, or if you plan to be on fires in the next decade? What do you see as the next important stories for fire?
Of course, I'd love to continue photographing the long exposures at night, in doing that aspect. But what we didn't see in this body of work, and what I've done a lot too for newspapers and like the Washington Post or National Geographic's photograph people and the firefighters on the ground, that human element of how these fires impact us. And also, I'd really like to go back and tell longer term stories of the communities that have been impacted. Sometimes I'm only in these places for a couple days and then I leave and I don't come back for a while. And I think it's really important that stories are told about the communities and the long-term human impacts of these fires. I mean, the entire town of Greenville was destroyed just in September. And there's thousands of people who are now houseless, and they might have to relocate from where generations of their families have lived. And I think that story is just as important as any breaking news fire story. And it may not be as cool visually, but it's an important story to tell, this human impact, because ultimately it's the stories we share and tell about each other that are going to help, I think, lead to change on an administrative level to better address the issues that we're seeing.
Thanks. And then there are a couple questions asking kind of along those lines about the role of photographers too in making room for fire, you know, in what it's going to be like to live with fire or to see ecosystems that, you know, need fire and experience regeneration from fire.
Well, I think nuance is important. And one thing I try and do is educate my media colleagues on framing. And sometimes we view it as like a war, like all fire is bad and we need to put it out. And, you know, this 10 a.m. suppression policy ain't going to cut it anymore. I mean, that is a failed policy that no longer is effective nor reasonable in this day and age, I think, with what we're facing now. Of course, if you've got a couple 100-acre grass fire in a subdivision with a lot of nice houses, of course you have to put it out. But yeah, I think this 100% suppression policy has helped lead to the conditions that we have today. And again, it is outside the scope of my full expertise and a discussion for another day. But the role I think photographers have in that is to tell that story, to tell the nuance, to say, hey, let's go out and photograph a prescribed burn. Let's show people what good fire looks like. Let's show crews in the winter or the spring putting good fire on the ground, cleaning up duff around pine trees. Or I had the privilege of telling the story of the South Fork of the gosh, I'm just blanking on the name, but it was an indigenous group in the Western Sierra in Mariposa, and I was invited to photograph their cultural burn in March. And they were restoring a meadow to its original state before fire had been excluded. And over 3 or 4 years, they'd reintroduced over a dozen species of plants and annual grasses there, which was really cool to see. And I think that we need to tell more of those stories, that it's not just, oh, here's a pyrocumulus and a 1,000,000-acre fire. Like, here's, you know, this grant where this, like the Southern Miwok tribe went out and burned 50 acres and brought this meadow back to how it should be. I think we need to tell those stories, because if we're going to have any sort of literacy for the general population on the role fire plays in our lives in the West, and let's face it, if you're anywhere in the West, you know, from the Front Range in Denver out to the Pacific Ocean, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you were affected by fire. So the more nuance we can have in the discussion, the better.
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing to bring that nuance. And I will hold up your first book, which is available now and has been out for a number of years, and then invite everybody also to check out your upcoming book, Into the Inferno, when it comes out. And I think it can be pre-ordered from probably all local bookstores now.
Of course, the local bookstore that helps support the series, you know, in Oregon, that would be a great one too. Any local bookstore is great. Of course, if you want to order it from a big website or a big bookseller, that's fine too. I'll probably be sharing a couple of pre-order links down the line, but I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to tell the story both in words and photos over the last couple of years, and opportunities like this to speak with you and the wonderful folks at OSU and the class later this week. It's really a privilege, and with you really do have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and everyone who's listening, I encourage you to continue tuning into this series, because I certainly will be. Next week, Stephen Pine, and I don't mean to jump the gun here on what you're saying, but I mean, he's a legend in the fire world. He's written a zillion books on fire. I mean, I have learned so much from reading his books, and I'm sure everyone here will enjoy what he has to say next week too.
No, that's perfect. You're doing my job for me this evening. I really appreciate it. So we'll put a link in chat to your work and also to our local bookstore, Grassroots Books and Music. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for all your work.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the county and Grassroots Books and OSU for co-sponsoring the series. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next Tuesday night.
All right.
Good night.